They say a man who chooses silence is hiding something. But out here in Dust Hollow, they believed something simpler. If a man doesn't speak, he must not matter. And that was the mistake they made the moment Elias Boone walked through their town. Boots slow against the dry boards of the main street. Dust rising in soft clouds around his heels. The sun cutting sharp lines across the buildings like a blade that never quite touched skin. He didn't look at anyone, didn't tip his hat, didn't reach for the swinging saloon doors until the last possible second. And when he stepped inside, the room shifted just enough to notice him, not because he demanded attention, but because he refused it. A man at the bar leaned over, smirking. "You lost your voice somewhere out there, cowboy." No answer, just the quiet weight of a man who had already heard worse and carried it farther than most could walk. The piano stumbled to a stop. Glasses paused halfway to lips, and someone laughed, low at first, then louder, the kind of laughter that spreads when people feel safe enough to be unkind. Elias stood there, shoulders square but easy, like he had all the time in the world and none of it belonged to anyone else. Another man stepped closer, circling just a little, testing the space. "Maybe he don't understand English," he said, louder now, inviting the room to join him. And they did, a ripple of voices. Jokes bouncing off the wooden walls, each one trying to land harder than the last, and still, nothing from Elias, not a glance, not a word, just that same stillness, like a man standing in a storm that never quite reaches him. Someone shoved a glass toward him. It tipped, spilled across the counter, amber liquid running in slow lines toward the edge, dripping onto the floorboards. "Drink," the man said, and when Elias didn't move, the smile on his face sharpened. "Were you too good for us?" A hand brushed Elias's shoulder. Not hard, not yet, just enough to see what would happen. And what happened was nothing. No reaction, no tension, just the same quiet that seemed to grow heavier the longer it stayed. And that was what unsettled them. Not defiance, not anger, but the absence of both. Because out here, men understood conflict, they understood pride, they understood the language of fists and fast words, but they did not understand a man who refused to play. The laughter came back, louder now, covering the thin edge of discomfort creeping through the room. Someone muttered, "He ain't right." And another answered, "He ain't anything." But across the room, near the far wall where the light didn't quite reach, a woman stood watching, her dark hair braided, her posture still as carved stone. Ayanna didn't laugh, didn't speak. Her eyes moved slowly over Elias, taking in the details no one else bothered to see. The way his hands rested away from his belt, the way his breathing never changed, the faint line of an old scar along his jaw. And something else, something hidden just beneath the edge of his coat, a glint of metal that caught the light for half a second before disappearing again. She didn't smile, because she recognized something the others didn't. This wasn't weakness, this was control. And control like that didn't come from nowhere. It came from something lived, something carried, something chosen. Back at the bar, the man leaned in closer, voice dropping just enough to make it personal. "You gonna stand there all day, or you gonna prove you're alive?" And for the first time, Elias lifted his eyes, not to challenge, not to threaten, just to look. And in that look was something quiet and heavy, something that didn't ask for understanding and didn't care if it came. The man hesitated, just for a second, something in his chest tightening without reason. And then he laughed it off, louder than before, because laughter was easier than listening, easier than wondering why a silent man could make a whole room feel like it had said too much already. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying dust down the street in long, slow trails, and far beyond the edge of town, something else moved with it, something that had already begun to change everything. Whether Dust Hollow was ready to hear it or not, the silence did not break when the laughter faded. It only settled deeper, like dust after a long ride, clinging to everything it touched, and the men who had filled the room with noise began to feel it, that weight pressing in where words used to be. The man at the bar cleared his throat, louder than necessary, as if sound alone could push it back. But Elias Boone had already stepped aside from the counter, not retreating, not advancing, just moving as if the space belonged to no one at all. And that unsettled them more than anything, because a man without claim, without pride to defend, was a man they did not know how to measure. Outside, the afternoon stretched long across the town, shadows leaning west, heat lifting from the ground in wavering lines, and one by one, the men followed him out, not out of courage, but because leaving first felt too much like losing, boots thudding onto the dry boards, then into the dirt, forming a loose circle that pretended not to be one. Voices rose again, softer now, testing, probing. "You think you are better than us?" someone asked, though the question sounded more like doubt than accusation. Elias did not answer, his gaze moving past them, not avoiding, just not stopping, as if he had already seen all this before, and in a way, he had. Iana stepped out into the light a moment later, the sun catching the beads at her wrist, her eyes never leaving Elias. She did not stand with the others, did not join their circle, she stayed just outside it, watching the way the air seemed to bend around him, watching the way his right hand never drifted near his holster, even when the tension thickened, even when the men edged closer, and that told her more than anything else, because out here, every man lived by instinct, and instinct said protect yourself, but Elias Boone had taught his instincts something different, something harder, something that required remembering. One of the younger men stepped forward, not drunk enough to be careless, not sober enough to be wise. "Say something," he said, almost pleading now, as if the silence itself had become a challenge he needed to end. Elias stopped walking then, not because of the words, but because of the sound behind them, faint at first, carried on the wind, hooves against hard ground, steady, measured, not the scattered rhythm of travelers, but something deliberate, something that moved with purpose. Iana heard it at the same moment, her head turning slightly toward the horizon, her expression tightening just enough to notice. The others did not hear it yet. They were still caught in their own noise, their own need to prove something that no longer made sense. The young man took another step closer. "You hear me?" he said, louder now, and Elias finally looked at him. Really looked, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to that single moment. No anger, no fear, just a quiet recognition that made the young man's voice falter before he even knew why. Then the sound grew clearer, hooves striking in unison, dust rising beyond the ridge in a long, low cloud, and now the others heard it too. Heads turning, voices trailing off mid-sentence, the circle loosening without anyone admitting it had been there. The town shifting from mockery to something else, something older, something that remembered what it meant when riders came like that. Not fast, not slow, just certain. Iana's gaze flicked back to Elias, searching, confirming, and what she saw made her breath still, not surprise, but understanding, because he did not move, did not reach, did not prepare. He simply stood, as if this moment had already been decided long before he ever set foot in Dust Hollow. The riders crested the rise then, dark shapes against the burning sky, their line unbroken, their pace unchanged, and the man who had asked Elias to speak felt the question die in his throat, because whatever answer he thought he wanted no longer seemed important, not with that kind of arrival unfolding just beyond the edge of town. And through it all, Elias Boone remained exactly where he was, silent, steady, and somehow at the center of something none of them yet understood. The riders did not slow as they entered Dust Hollow, and that alone told every man watching that this was not a visit. It was a purpose. Their horses moved in a straight line down the main street, hooves striking the earth in a steady rhythm that seemed to quiet even the wind. No one spoke now, not the men who had laughed, not the ones who had pushed, not even the ones who had said nothing and watched, because something had shifted, something older than pride and louder than mockery had stepped into their town. The lead rider raised a hand, and the others stopped as one, not a single horse stepping out of line. Dust drifting around them in slow curls, the kind that hangs in the air longer than it should, the kind that makes a place feel like it is holding its breath. Iana took one step forward, not toward the riders, but closer to Elias, her eyes flicking once to his face, searching for any sign of surprise, any crack in that stillness. But there was none, only the same quiet presence, as if this moment had been waiting for him instead of the other way around. The lead rider dismounted, boots touching the ground with a deliberate calm, his gaze sweeping the gathered townspeople before settling on Elias Boone. And in that look there was no confusion, no question, only recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. A murmur moved through the crowd, soft, uncertain, Names whispered that no one had used in years, titles remembered too late. The man who had stood closest to Elias earlier took a slow step back, without realizing he was doing it, his confidence draining away like water through cracked earth, because now he saw it, not in Elias's face, but in the way the riders held themselves, in the way the air seemed to settle around him instead of pressing against him. The lead rider removed his hat, not quickly, not for show, but with a quiet respect that carried more weight than any shouted word. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, clear enough for all to hear. "Marshal Boone," he said, and the title landed heavier than any insult that had come before it. The town felt it, a ripple moving through every man and woman standing there, the realization spreading piece by piece. The silent cowboy they had mocked was not what they had believed, not what they had decided he must be. Ayanna watched their faces change, saw the doubt replace certainty, saw the understanding arrive too late to undo what had already been done, and still, Elias did not answer. He did not step forward, did not claim the name that had just been given back to him in front of all of them. He simply stood, the same man they had tried to measure and failed, the same man who had offered them nothing and taken even less. The lead rider's gaze softened just slightly, as if he understood something the others did not, as if he knew that the silence was not absence but choice, and that choice carried a story no one here had earned the right to hear. The wind moved again, lifting the edge of Elias's coat just enough for the metal beneath to catch the light, a bent badge, worn and marked, not displayed but not hidden either, and Ayanna's breath slowed as she saw it clearly for the first time, not a symbol of authority, but of something broken and carried anyway. Behind her, one of the townsmen spoke without thinking, his voice smaller than before. "Why does he not say anything?" And the question hung there, fragile, almost afraid of its own answer. Ayanna did not look at him when she replied, her eyes still on Elias, her voice low but steady. "Because the last time he did, someone paid for it." And the words settled over the town like a truth they had not asked for, but could not ignore. The lead rider inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, not in contradiction, but in acknowledgement, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, filled with everything they had not seen, everything they had not understood, and in the center of it all, Elias Boone remained exactly as he had been from the moment he arrived, still, quiet, and carrying something none of them were ready to face. No one moved after her words settled, not because they understood, but because they felt the weight of something they could not name, the kind of truth that does not ask for permission before it changes a room. The man who had laughed the loudest earlier shifted his stance, boots scraping lightly against the dirt as if he could step away from what had already happened. But there was no stepping away from this, not anymore. The lead rider took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving Elias. "We rode 30 miles to find you," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying across the street. "Without effort. There is trouble north of the ridge, the kind that does not wait for men to make up their minds." A pause, not long, just enough to let the meaning settle. "We were told you would know what to do." The town listened, every ear turned now not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to need, because whatever had brought these riders here was bigger than pride, bigger than whatever small judgments had filled this place an hour ago. Ayanna's gaze shifted slightly, not away from Elias, but deeper, as if she was watching something unfold inside him rather than around him, because she understood now that the silence was not emptiness, it was restraint, the kind that takes more strength than any loud declaration. Elias did not answer, not yet. His eyes moved past the rider, past the line of horses, toward the horizon where the light had begun to soften, the sun lowering inch by inch, stretching shadows long across the ground, and for a moment, it seemed like he might simply turn and walk away from all of it, leave the town, leave the riders, leave the weight where it stood, and no one there could have stopped him, not with force, not with words, because they had already proven they did not understand the language he lived by. The rider took one step forward, not demanding, not commanding, just closing the distance enough to be heard without raising his voice. "Marshal," he said again, quieter this time, and the words sounded different now, less like a title, and more like a memory being offered back. Elias's hand moved then, not toward his gun, not toward any threat, but to the edge of his coat, fingers brushing against the bent badge beneath. He did not take it out, did not show it, just held it there for a brief second, like a man touching something that still carried heat long after the fire had gone. Ayanna saw it, and in that small movement, she understood more than any story could explain. This was not a man who had lost his voice. This was a man who had buried it, carefully, deliberately, because he knew what it could do. Behind them, one of the townsmen spoke again, softer now, stripped of the edge it once had. If he will not speak, then what are we supposed to do? And this time, no one laughed, no one answered, because the question was no longer about Elias. It was about them, about what they had chosen to see and what they had ignored. The wind shifted once more, carrying with it the faint smell of distant rain, a change coming from somewhere beyond the ridge, and the rider waited, not impatient, not pressing, because some decisions cannot be rushed. They can only be faced. Elias lifted his head slightly, his gaze returning from the horizon to the people in front of him, the ones who had mocked him, the ones who now watched him like something fragile might break if they spoke too loudly. And for the first time since he arrived, there was something different in his eyes, not anger, not forgiveness, but a quiet reckoning, as if he was measuring not them, but himself, measuring what it would cost to break the silence he had chosen, and whether the world standing in front of him was worth that cost. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching farther, and the moment held, balanced on something no one could see, but all of them could feel, waiting for a voice that had once changed everything and might do so again. The town did not breathe as the light began to fade, the kind of slow, creeping dusk that stretched every shadow until it touched something it was not meant to reach. And in that long silence, every man standing there felt the same thing without saying it. This was no longer about a stranger passing through. This was about a choice none of them were prepared to make. The rider's words still hung in the air, not demanding, not fading, just waiting. And Elias Boone stood in the center of it like a man carved out of something older than the town itself, unmoved by the eyes now fixed on him, unmoved by the weight they were trying to place back on his shoulders. Ayanna shifted her stance slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just aligning herself with the moment as it unfolded, her voice quiet but steady as she spoke again, not to the crowd, not even to the rider, but to the silence itself. "He does not refuse because he cannot help you," she said. "He refuses because he remembers. What happens when he does?" The words settled deeper this time, not sharp, not sudden, but heavy, like something that had been carried too long to be spoken lightly. One of the older men in the crowd removed his hat without realizing it, his fingers tightening along the brim as if holding on to something that was already slipping away. "What happened?" he asked, not loudly, not with authority, but with something closer to humility. And that was new. That was something this town had not offered. Before, Ayanna did not answer him directly. Her eyes remained on Elias, waiting, because this was not her story to tell, not fully, not yet. The wind carried a faint chill now, the first sign that the day was truly ending, and with it came a stillness that felt different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but expectant, like the world itself was holding back just enough to see what would come next. Elias's fingers moved again against the edge of his coat, slower this time, deliberate, as if each motion had to pass through something unseen before it could be made real. The bent badge caught the last of the sunlight for a brief second, a dull glint that spoke of something worn, something tested, something that had not been discarded even when it should have been easier to let it go. The rider watched him carefully, not pressing, not urging, because men who had seen enough knew when silence was not refusal, but struggle. And this was something deeper than hesitation. This was a man, standing at the edge of something he had once walked away from, something he had buried under miles of road and years of quiet, and now it was standing in front of him again, asking without words to be faced. Behind them, the town shifted, not physically, but in the way people held themselves, in the way their eyes moved, no longer searching for weakness, no longer looking for something to laugh at, but searching for understanding, for a reason they could hold on to, because the alternative was admitting they had been wrong about something that mattered, and that was harder than any silence. The young man who had first demanded Elias speak lowered his gaze, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by something uncertain and unsteady, as if he was seeing not just Elias, but himself reflected in a way he did not recognize. The sky deepened to a darker shade, the last line of sunlight slipping behind the ridge, and with it, the moment narrowed, tightening around Elias like a quiet question that would not go away. Ayanna took one slow breath, her voice softer now, almost lost in the evening air. Some men use words to carry power, she said. He learned they can also carry consequence. And this time, no one interrupted, no one questioned. Because the truth in it was too clear to ignore, Elias lifted his eyes once more, not to the rider, not to the crowd, but to the space between them, as if measuring something only he could see. And for a heartbeat, it seemed like he might turn away, leave them to their own answers, leave the town to learn its lesson without him. But instead, he took one step forward, slow, steady, not toward the rider, not toward the crowd, but into the space where silence and expectation met. And though he still had not spoken, something had already changed, because for the first time, it felt like he might. The step he took did not echo loud, but it carried farther than any word spoken that day, and the town felt it. A shift so quiet it could have been mistaken for nothing if not for the way every eye followed him now. Not with mockery, not with doubt, but with something closer to caution. Elias Boone did not rush, did not claim the space he had entered. He simply stood there, one pace closer to the choice he had avoided for so long. The rider watched him with the patience of a man who understood that some distances are not measured in feet or miles, but in memory, and this was a long one. Ayanna did not move, but her gaze softened, not with relief, but with recognition, because she had seen this before in others. The moment when a person stands between who they were and who they have chosen to become, and the ground beneath them feels less certain than the sky above. The wind brushed through the street again, lighter now, carrying the scent of dust, and something else, something unsettled beyond the ridge, a reminder that whatever waited out there had not paused for this town to find its understanding. One of the riders shifted slightly in his saddle, not out of impatience, but as if the silence itself had weight, the kind that presses on the chest the longer it stays. "We do not have much time," the lead rider said, not raising his voice, not forcing the moment, just placing the truth where it belonged, and letting it stand. Elias's hand dropped from his coat, the small, unconscious gesture gone now, replaced by something steadier, more resolved. His shoulders straightened just a fraction, not enough for those who did not know what to look for, but enough for Ayanna to see it clearly. This was not the stance of a man hiding from himself anymore. This was the beginning of someone stepping back into something he had once carried. Behind them, the townspeople shifted again, but this time it was different. No longer the restless movement of men waiting for entertainment, but the quiet adjustment of people realizing they were standing in the presence of something they had misunderstood. The older man who had asked what happened lowered his head slightly, not in shame, not fully, but in something close, as if he was beginning to understand that the answer mattered less than the weight it carried. Elias lifted his gaze toward the rider at last, not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple meeting of eyes that held more than any speech could have offered, and in that moment, the distance between them closed without a single word. The rider nodded once, not as an order, not as a command, but as acknowledgement, because he saw it too, the change that had already begun. Ayanna's voice came again, softer than before, carried by the fading light. "Some debts are not paid with action," she said. "They are paid with truth." And the words settled into the space between them, not as pressure, but as something to hold on to. Elias did not look at her, but something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptible, like a door opening just enough to let something through. The sky had darkened now, the last colors draining into shadow, and the first hint of night stretched across the land, bringing with it a stillness that felt less like waiting and more like arrival. This was the moment, not announced, not forced, just present. Elias Boone drew a slow breath, the kind that comes from deep inside, not from habit, but from decision, and though no sound left him yet, the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall, no longer something that kept the world out. It had become something else entirely, something that held meaning instead of hiding it. And as the town watched, as the riders waited, as the night settled in around them. It became clear that whatever came next would not be the breaking of silence, but the choosing of it, and that choice would matter more than anything they had done before. The night did not fall all at once. It crept in slowly, laying shadow over wood and dust, softening the edges of everything until the town no longer looked as certain as it had just hours before. And in that quiet, dim light, Elias Boone stood with the weight of a choice no one else could see, but all of them could feel. The riders waited without shifting, their patience not empty but earned, because men who had ridden 30 miles without breaking formation did not mistake silence for indecision. They knew the difference between hesitation and reckoning, and this was the latter. Ayanna watched the change in Elias the way one watches a storm form far out on the horizon, not with fear, but with understanding that something inevitable was moving closer. His shoulders no longer held the distance they once did. There was no retreat in him now, no turning away, only a steady presence that seemed to root deeper into the ground with every passing second. The town felt it, even those who could not name it. The younger man who had once demanded words now stood with his hands at his sides, fingers loose, no longer reaching for attention, no longer trying to prove himself against something he did not understand. The older man lowered his gaze fully now, hat pressed against his chest, not out of obligation, but because something inside him recognized that respect had been owed long before this moment arrived. The lead rider stepped closer again, just enough to stand within speaking distance without raising his voice. "We have families waiting beyond that ridge," he said, each word measured, each one carrying weight without force. "They will look to us for direction, and we cannot give it without you." There was no urgency in his tone, only truth, and that truth did not push Elias forward. It met him where he stood. Ayanna's eyes flicked once toward the dark line of hills in the distance, then back to Elias. Her voice quiet, almost lost in the wind. "You do not speak for them," she said. "You speak for what is right." And that distinction settled deeper than anything else had, because it did not ask him to return to what he had been. It asked him to choose what he would be now. Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment, not long enough for anyone to question it, but long enough for the past to move through him like a shadow crossing open land. And when he opened them again, something had shifted, not in expression, not in posture, but in presence. The silence that surrounded him no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a tool, something held with care instead of fear. The wind stilled, the town quieted. Even the horses seemed to settle as if the land itself understood what was about to happen. Elias Boone drew another slow breath, deeper this time, and for the first time since he had stepped into Dust Hollow, his voice came, low, steady, not loud enough to command, but strong enough to carry. "You listen first," he said, the words simple, unadorned, but they moved through the space like something long withheld and finally released. The town felt it immediately, not as sound, but as weight, because this was not a man speaking to be heard. This was a man choosing his words with the knowledge of what they could do. The rider nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging that the moment had come. Elias did not continue right away. He let the silence return, not as before, not as absence, but as space for those words to settle. And in that space, every person standing there understood something they had not before, that the voice they had demanded earlier was never meant to entertain them. It was meant to guide, to measure, to carry consequence. And now that it had been given, even in its smallest form, it had already begun to change everything. The word he had spoken did not fade. It settled, like dust that chooses where it belongs and refuses to be moved. And in that quiet aftermath, the town felt smaller somehow, not in size, but in certainty, because everything they had believed about Elias Boone had just been undone by a single sentence. The rider took another step closer, not to close distance, but to stand within the space that Elias had opened. "Then we listen," he said, his voice carrying the same steadiness, but now shaped by something new, not expectation, but trust. And that trust did not come from rank or reputation. It came from recognition, from knowing that the man in front of him did not speak lightly. Elias did not answer right away. His gaze moved slowly across the faces in front of him, not judging, not condemning, just seeing, really seeing, and for many of them, It was the first time they had ever felt what it meant to be looked at without assumption. The younger man dropped his eyes first, unable to hold that gaze, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, the realization that he had spoken too quickly, acted too easily, and now stood in front of a man who had chosen silence rather than risk doing the same. Ayanna stepped forward then, just one pace, enough to stand beside Elias without claiming the moment, her presence steady, her voice low but clear. "Tell them what they must hear, not what they want," she said. And though the words were directed at Elias, they seemed to settle over the entire town, because they understood now that what came next would not be easy. Elias lifted his chin slightly, the faint light of early night catching the edge of his face. And when he spoke again, his voice carried farther, not louder, but stronger, shaped by purpose rather than hesitation. "North of the ridge," he said, pausing just enough to let the direction settle in their minds. "You have men who do not trust each other, and that is where trouble begins." He did not rush the words, each one placed with care, like stones forming a path that others would have to walk. The rider listened without interruption, his posture straight, his focus complete, because this was no longer a request, it was guidance. Elias's eyes moved briefly toward the dark horizon, then back to the town. "You do not meet them with fear, and you do not meet them with pride," he continued, and there was something in his tone now that held authority without force, the kind that comes from knowing the cost of being wrong. "You meet them with patience, and you listen before you decide what you think you know." The words hung there, not dramatic, not grand, but heavy in a way that made them impossible to ignore. The older man nodded slowly, not because he fully understood, but because he felt the truth in it. The rider inclined his head again. "And if they do not listen?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a man preparing for what might come. Elias did not hesitate this time. "Then you do not become them," he said, simple, direct, and in that moment, the meaning reached further than the ridge, further than the situation waiting out there. It reached into the town itself, into what had happened earlier, into the way they had treated a man they did not understand. The silence returned again, but it was no longer uncertain. It was full, shaped by what had been said, and what had been revealed without needing to be spoken aloud. Ayanna's eyes moved across the crowd, watching the shift settle into place. The laughter gone, the certainty replaced with something quieter, something more careful. Elias took a small step back then, not retreating, but releasing the moment, giving it back to those who needed it, his voice falling silent once more, not as before, not as absence, but as completion, because he had said what needed to be said, no more, no less. And in that restraint, there was a kind of finality that no one dared to break. The rider turned slightly toward his men, a subtle signal, not rushed, not urgent, but clear. They would ride again, but not as they had come, not with uncertainty, but with direction. And as the town watched them prepare to leave, they understood something they had not before, that the man they had mocked had not been empty. He had been holding something they had not yet earned, and now that he had given it, even in part, they could not pretend they had not received it. The riders did not rush their departure, and that, more than anything, stayed with the people of Dust Hollow, because men who understood urgency often moved fast, but men who understood truth moved with care. The lead rider mounted his horse with a steady motion, his eyes meeting Elias Boone's one last time, not with gratitude spoken aloud, but with something quieter, something earned, and then he nodded once. A gesture small enough to miss if you were not looking, but no one missed it now, not. After everything that had been said without being shouted, the line of riders turned as one, their horses stepping back onto the road that led beyond the ridge, and as they moved, the sound of hooves carried differently than before, not sharp, not uncertain, but grounded, like a decision already made. Ayanna remained where she stood, her gaze following them only for a moment before returning to Elias, because she knew the true weight of the moment was not leaving with those riders, it was staying here, in the quiet space they left behind. The town did not speak, not immediately, because words now felt heavier than they had that morning, harder to use without consequence. The younger man who had once demanded Elias speak took a slow breath, his voice low when it finally came. "I thought silence meant there was nothing there," he said, not to Elias directly, but to the ground between them, and no one laughed. No one corrected him, because they had all thought the same in one way or another. The older man placed his hat back on his head, but not the same way as before, his movement slower, more deliberate, as if even that small action required more thought now. Elias did not respond to either of them. He did not offer comfort, did not offer explanation, because that was not what they needed. What they needed was space to understand what had already been given. Ayanna stepped closer to him then, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. "You did not break your silence," she said. "You chose it." And there was no judgment in her tone, only acknowledgement. Elias's gaze shifted slightly toward her, not fully turning, just enough to recognize her presence. And for a brief moment, something in his expression softened, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something lighter, as if a burden had been set down just enough to be carried differently. The night had fully settled now, the last of the light gone beyond the hills, and the town looked different in the dark, less certain, less defined, like it was still deciding what it would become after this day. One by one, the people began to move, not away from Elias, not quickly, but with a quiet understanding that the moment had ended and something else had begun. No one reached out, no one asked for more, because they had learned, in the span of a single evening, that not everything needed to be spoken to be understood. Elias adjusted the edge of his coat, the bent badge hidden once more beneath the fabric, not concealed, not displayed, simply carried, the way it always had been. He turned then, not toward the saloon, not toward the riders, but toward the open road that led out of Dust Hollow, his steps steady, unhurried, as if he had always known he would leave the same way he arrived, without announcement, without need for recognition. Ayanna watched him go, her eyes following until the darkness took his shape and turned it into part of the horizon. And for a long moment after he disappeared, she remained still, as if listening for something that no longer needed to be heard. Behind her, the town stood quieter than it had ever been, not because it had lost something, but because it had learned something it could not unlearn. And though no one said it aloud, the truth settled deep into the dust and wood of that place, that out here, a man did not need to raise his voice to change the world around him. He only needed to know when to use it, and when to let silence do the rest.